So I'm Heidi Parker. I'm here today as a grant consultant for the Office of Vice President of Research. This is really great that MSU does this for you guys. And so we're going to lead this panel discussion today with all my experts up here, which I'll introduce in a second. And their individual research isn't that important, but it's awesome. So if you can take a second to look it up after this, that would be great. And what I'd like to convey in this, after this today, I have a 4-part seminar series. And what I want people to understand is that your grant can't be too good or too perfect. You never know who you're up against. And there's one person in this world who thinks you're amazing and you've already done a PhD and your grades were great in undergrad and you did a postdoc and now you're here and you got a job and you shouldn't have to grovel for money and ask for more things. But your mom 100% is not a reviewer. She's not. She would give you really good points, but she's not. She could probably even talk the other people into thinking you're great. But you cannot predict the reviewers you're going to get. You can't predict the competition that you're going to get. So in different departments, some people will think this is more important than that. But what you need to understand is that every section needs to be as good as, as best as it possibly can. Okay, so here are my panelists today. First, we have Robin Buell from plant biology. Second, we have Xiaobo Tan from electrical and computer engineering. And then we have Kevin Elliott from the Lyman Briggs, which is history and philosophy of science. And then finally, Matt Comstock from physics and astronomy. Dr. Jim McCusker from chemistry is very sick with the flu and cannot make it, but he was so excited that he sent his answers to me. And I wish I could do an amazing impression of him and read them, but I'm just going to read it in my own voice. So you guys can interject with questions at any time. We have a microphone that will travel back there and come around. So the first question for everybody, so you'll have to pull the mics towards you and lean in a little bit. Briefly, what's been your experience with NSF funding?
All right. So I've been funded since 1999 from NSF, mostly from the Plant Genome Research Program, which is a very specialized. Oops. Okay. So I've been funded since 1999 from NSF funding, mostly from the Plant Genome Research Program, which is a pretty specific program at NSF. And I'd say my experience has been it gets harder and harder every year to get funded from them. And I also have had funding from the MCB division, and again, it just gets harder and harder to get funding. They restrict the submission times, the number of submissions, and the funding rate continually goes down. So I think the main thing is to make sure you know whether or not your idea is going to be fundable, and as Heidi said, have the best grant possible. I think that's enough for now. Yeah.
So I joined MSU in 2004. So I got my first grant, I believe, in 2005. And my career grant in 2006, and so far we have been a PI or co-PI for about 15 or 16 NSF grants. So I think for me it's lucky to have like almost 3 core programs I can submit a proposal to, and then there are of course a lot of cross-cutting programs these days, which we have been to some extent successful. I have also served 20-something, 24 NSF panels, including a few career panels. So I'll be happy to talk about the point of view from panelists.
So maybe my role here is to be helpful for those of you who aren't as experienced, because I'm not exceptionally experienced with NSF grants. I'm a philosopher of science, and currently I'm the lead PI on a grant that's under a sort of an interdisciplinary umbrella, Cultivating Cultures for Ethical STEM. I was also a co-PI in the past on a nanotechnology interdisciplinary research grant. And currently we have a grant pending with myself and a group under the program for the Science of Science and Innovation Policy, and also a graduate research traineeship grant for data-enabled science. So the kind of work I do can sort of mix and match with a lot of different programs in NSF, looking at various aspects of ethics and the cultural context surrounding the sciences.
So I offer, I guess, a more junior perspective. So I'm pre-tenure and been here about 3 years now. And and I'm in physics, but I do biological physics, which means a lot of times I can submit to NSF or NIH, and sometimes it's tricky to decide whether more physics or where more biology aspect is the key. So I submitted a couple NSF proposals and have one of them funded from the bio division of NSF right now. That's all I'll say there.
Okay, so Jim McCusker wanted me to make sure the audience understood and not be too discouraged at the really low funding rates, because the funding rates for the career grants is actually a little bit higher than the bleak funding rates for the unsolicited grants. But he also said there's a lot of really good science that doesn't get funded the first time. And he said even he has been denied. So it's all about sort of turning that rejection in those reviews into something positive. Okay, what's next? What is your writing process like?
So for my writing process, what we actually do, we actually sit down and we decide what do we want to do. And second of all, we then make a funding budget target because we know a certain budget will not be funded. So you don't want to be too low, you don't want to be too high. So we make a strategic decision of what kind of budget we're going to request. And then we fill in objectives from there that fit that budget. And I think that's actually pretty important. A lot of people put a proposal together and then they're going to ask for too much money. And in my experience being on panels and also getting the grant review back, it really will just put you out of consideration right away. So we always look at like, okay, how much can we write for? And then we fill in these specific objectives based on that, on the general topic. And then what we will do then is work on the objectives first and make sure that they're reasonable. What almost always happens is that if we have 5 objectives, the first 3 will be written very, very strong, and the last 4, or the last 2, which are dependent on the outcomes of the first 3, are very weak. And then we actually will spend a lot of time strengthening those so that they actually come together a little bit more, because that's always the weakest part of the proposal. You're not going to know what you're going to do in the last year or 2 of the grant until you've collected all the other data, but you don't want it to be like this open-ended, well, after we do this amount of work, we'll think about what we're going to do. So you have to spend a lot of time how to phrase that so you don't get yourself trapped into something, but also not so vague that it's not really defined. And then we'll work on the introduction. Then we'll work on the rationale, and the last thing we'll work on is the broader impacts, because that's always the last part of the grant that goes in. And we also start all the supplemental paperwork in the beginning. We like to do that first, and then spend the last time you have before the grant's due actually on the experimental plan. So we try to do some upfront administrative work early on so that we're not trying to do that as well in the last few days of the grant deadline.
Robin has said it really well. All I want to emphasize is what you're writing should be a story as opposed to how do I fill up the 15 pages. So I usually have a hard time struggling coming up with the story because you want a story to be intriguing. It's an important story and it has details and it is convincing. So, but once you have everything kind of set, I think the writing itself is actually relatively straightforward. I used to, when I first started, I used to leave about 1 month. I said I should have my draft done 1 month before and then have time to revise and polish. But very quickly I found that's not possible just because when you have more time, you think, okay, maybe I should spend time thinking more about the ideas as opposed to try to finish off the draft, which I think actually turns out to be something I think it's good. It doesn't mean you have to wait until last minute to finish a draft, but you should leave some good time kind of brainstorming. If it's a group project and you want to get together more than 1 time, maybe more than 5 times, just to sort through the good ideas, eliminate the weak points, identify the loopholes, and then you start writing. I know later on we'll talk about multidisciplinary projects, but overall I think coming up with a coherent story is more important than rushing into writing.
Yeah, I actually really love that suggestion about coming up with a coherent story. I think maybe I just mention, at least in my experience, it's been really helpful to think through what is sort of the key hole or the key gap that we can fill. So in terms of telling this story, so what's happened before, and then what is it that needs to be done, and how are we going to fill that gap? And I agree, the meetings to sort of hash out, so what are going to be our sort of key concepts, our key message, our key objectives, and then, you know, some delegation can happen once you've got that sort of key story among, you know, who's going to do what first. And maybe this is just the non-technological philosopher that, you know, didn't know to do this, but it's been very helpful learning to, you know, plan things out on, you know, Google Documents so that you can all be accessing it at once, and having one person lay out the initial draft of particular pieces, and then everybody else can fill in. I guess I'd also just say, you know, as was pointed out, the value of initially planning a month in advance or changing that. I find it really helpful to find out from the MSU folks, when exactly do we need to get these different pieces in at the end, and then planning back from that to figure out when things need to be done.
Yeah, on the administrative side, at least in NatSci, we have really great support staff for getting grants submitted. And many things that they're going to do for you are disconnected from the grant writing, right? So if you can get it on your radar, oh, I'm going to apply for NIH, NSF, or whatever in this cycle months in advance, just tell them. And they don't need anything hardly about the details, right? But have the budget made up. About the story, which I completely agree with, just one thing I would like to emphasize is to not get so tangled up in your great story and your ideas and how great the ideas are that you forget who you are and whether it makes sense that you can sell this story, that you are the person for the job, and that you're not overselling, you know, the ideas and they're disconnected from your expertise. You know, that you can also sell that you are the right person, the best person to do that job.
Great. So Jim McCusker, when we spoke on the phone, we also talked a lot about, even though he's been doing this since the 1980s, he still starts with an outline and really thinks about and will even draw out how he's going to sell this story and making it exciting and making it something that's pleasurable to read. And then he also said he passes off his written grant to grad students and postdocs, not for them to really do that much work, even though they can do some simple editing, but to get feedback. And also it's a learning experience for them, because all of a sudden they're going to be, you know, junior PIs and have to do this and have no idea what they're doing. So yeah. Okay, any advice on preliminary data? Matt, do you want to start, since you were kind of segueing into that?
So again, my experience is limited to, you know, in years and in the field I'm in. It seems in my field you cannot have too much preliminary data. It seems like there's every year it gets worse and worse, that the grants, you're proposing something you've essentially already completed sometimes. At least enough data to show proof of concept of the kinds of the plans, of the things that you propose to do. So it seems in my field there's an awful lot of preliminary data supporting, say, if it divided up the grant into 3 aims, that maybe the first 2 aims for sure are strongly supported by pilot experiments and things that you've already done.
So the philosopher here is useless for talking about preliminary data, so I'll just pass it on.
I know there's some talking saying if I provide too much preliminary data, the reviewer will say you have done it, so we should not give you money. And then, of course, if you have no data, then they say, how do you support your idea? So it is, I think it's a balance. In general, you want to provide, if you have any, you want to provide the data such that it will support the basic idea or some feasibility, but clearly not the bulk of your proposal. So my tendency is if I have something to support the idea or the approach, I will include it. And if you, sometimes, especially someone who has just started, has never submitted a proposal, you have a lot of results already, my suggestion is that you carefully select what to include. So I'm not saying you should not fully disclose, but just be why, cautious about what you think is going to be most helpful for the proposal itself. But in general, I think it's a good idea to have some preliminary results.
Yeah, definitely having preliminary data is going to give you a leg up, right? Because it's going to show that, maybe your potential hypothesis is valid, and it also shows that you have competency. Another thing that I do on quite a few of my grants, almost all my grants are multi-investigator, is like on the first page, I'll list my objectives, with maybe like a 5-sentence introduction, and then they explicitly know on page 1 what my objectives are. And then at the bottom of that page, I put research team. And then I have about 2 sentences for each investigator, which I say, she has 20 years experience in, genomics. And then I add a whole bunch of citations. And so right away on the first page, they know who's on the team, who's got what expertise, and then who has what credentials. And so then if you have not as much preliminary data as you would like, they already know right away, because they haven't gone to look at the biosketch, they haven't read anything. So right away by page 1, they have a snapshot of what you're thinking of doing. They have hopefully confidence that you're competent and you each have something unique to contribute to the project, and that you're essentially the expert in the field. And so we use that quite a bit so that when we go through the rest of the proposal, it's already clear to them that we've got the right team for the right set of objectives. And that'll compensate when you don't have as much preliminary data as you would like.
Right, so preliminary data often feeds into this idea of feasibility. And because you're all young PIs, you don't have a huge established career where you're the absolute expert on some giant area. So if you can show preliminary data to basically, when the reviewers read this, they're not asking, can she really do this? Is he going to be able to take this money and do this? You want them to have no question. And so this idea of adding preliminary data to show that, yes, she can do this, I see this there, they've demonstrated this before. And again, if you're a younger person and you're not quite the expert, this preliminary data helps you, but what can also help you is a collaborator, a senior collaborator. So that brings us to the next question. How do you handle collaborations?
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing you can do if you're a junior investigator is in each one of my objectives on the experimental plan, at the end of each objective, we'll have problems and pitfalls. And so right away, if we're going to do a major technique, we'll say, we do not foresee any problems with this technique because we have this experience, and we'll add a citation, right? And then if you know there's going to be potential problems, or, oh, maybe you're not too sure, you could actually say something like, well, there's an expert in the department or here at the university, and I can seek advice or something like that, because that's another way to address any concerns a reviewer might have. Well, maybe you won't be able to do it, we think you can, but we're not sure, but you would have at least demonstrated you've thought about any potential problems. And a lot of people cut that out because they run out of space. I think it's really helpful because it shows you've thought about the methods, you've thought about all the problems you might have, and you've already thought about a way to potentially address them. So for collaborations, as I said, almost every project I have is a collaborative project, and it's sometimes hard to find a good collaborator. You sometimes seek them out because they have expertise and that you want to have them on there because you're complementary. Sometimes you're not a good fit, and you find that out after the grant got started, and then you're like, ooh, okay, I got to get through this. But for me, it's very strategic, who do you ask to be on that grant, because there's only so many pieces of the pie, and you've got to think about what are they going to bring to the project. But you can work productively with them. And the one other thing that we always do, I'm a senior faculty member, so it's not so important to me. Once we get the team, we've decided who's going to be on the team. The first question we ask is, are you in the EPSCoR state? And if somebody's in an EPSCoR state, we'll ask them to be the PI if they want to be, because that has a funding advantage. So we also sit down strategically and we'll go, who would be the best PI to get this project funded? And so, for a senior faculty, it's not that big of a deal who's the PI. But for junior, certainly it could be important that you have to be the PI. So we spend a lot of time just thinking strategy, like who's the best collaborator, who's going to be the right collaborators to bring onto a project, who would serve as the best PI for the project, as well as, who has the time to do it as well. So we spend a lot of time thinking of those things because we're not also worried about I have to be the PI and I have to be in control. But I think those are some other concerns that people would have. And for junior faculty, I think, sometimes there's an advantage to be a co-PI, because if a senior person's the PI, the grant may seem to rank better in the panel, but also it may be very important that you be the PI of a grant in a collaboration. And so I think you got to really sort of look at what you're trying to do, and if there's any advantage to getting the grant funded, and then once it is funded, is it actually going to be successful based on the composition of the collaborators?
So I think you made a very good point about finding the right collaborator, because my own experience tells me that it's very important. If you have good collaborators, things will go very easy, and you'll be productive, and you probably have multiple funded grants, joint papers. And sometimes collaborators are not always, collaboration does not always work out. Personality mismatch, for example. And you thought this is going to go like that, but later on you find this person is not what you have imagined. So there might be some surprises or even unpleasant cases, but don't get discouraged. If you think that your research requires collaboration, you should definitely go and seek out people and talk to people. And over years, you will collect a good set of collaborators, which of course the list will be growing. But it's important to, when you have good collaborators, make sure you protect and how to nurture that collaboration so that it will develop in a healthy way. So of course, when you have proposal funded, that's what you said. There might be cases, some PIs just want to put your name on there so that the proposal gets funded, and he or she may not be really interested in what you do. Okay, and then of course, in that case, you learn from that. And if you are leading something, you are doing something, and the proposal gets funded, my suggestion is make sure, especially if you are the lead PI, make sure that the collaboration really goes well by managing the project, putting your time, and having group meetings, and so that to promote that kind of collaboration, because this is not just a one-time deal, right? Because you get the grant, that's very good. You have the resources to do it together, but make sure this is going to lay the groundwork for the next grant.
So yeah, all of my grant work has been very collaborative and very interdisciplinary. And one thing I would add is that when you if you have the time and the luxury to start developing collaborations a little bit before you actually have to go after a particular grant, I think it's really helpful to find out, do I actually work well with these folks? And I think that you can have a more compelling grant proposal. Again, if you've already started working together, it may provide an opportunity to get preliminary data. And so I would just highlight opportunities at MSU with internal funding opportunities to start laying the groundwork for collaborations. With more environmentally oriented research, the ESPP program here has an interdisciplinary team building initiative set of grants that one can get some money to actually start collaborating with other people. We also have our Science and Society at State S3 program, which I'll touch on again when we talk about broader impacts, provides a really nice opportunity for folks in the natural sciences or social sciences to start collaborating with folks from other disciplines, even natural scientists with social scientists or natural scientists with people in the humanities, that can help in developing broader impacts, but can also help you figure out, okay, do we have the potential to work well here? And so I think that taking advantage of some of those internal funding opportunities can help lay the groundwork for collaborations in helpful ways.
So all the biophysical work we do is highly collaborative, and it's essential often because we have measurement techniques, for example, that can be applied to other people's samples, and we can't produce samples ourselves. And a lot of advice in our field that we get often related to this is about being careful to manage risk with the collaborators and ranking of how well the collaboration might be perceived by grant reviewers, and risk involved with working with them. So someone legitimately may ask the question of what would happen to your experiment, for example, if your collaborator ceased collaborating with you, if the lab moved, if the person retired, heaven forbid, or something, and they no longer produce samples. These things happen, and we know about this. So we work in some sort of contingencies, so we're storing things, we're producing samples ahead of time, whatever. Also issues of how the collaboration will be perceived. Is it local? Is it international? Is it on campus? And do you have a track record already with these people? Is it something you just put together randomly? Or is there some evidence that you guys can actually work well together and are a good fit? So naively, if you've published papers together already, that would be great. If you've already started and have preliminary data, that would be great. If you're on campus, that's better, possibly. If you don't have these things, then if you're on the other side of the world, these are some of the good advice I think I've gotten.
Actually, jump in with one other comment I would just note is there is an interesting body of literature developing on what people are calling the science of team science, and the National Research Council came out with a report last year on this, and there's actually a group, if you Google it, a group associated with the NIH that's holding conferences on it and so on. So if you really wanted to learn a lot about collaboration, you probably don't have time at this point to be doing that, but there is some really interesting work developing coming out of psychology and so on how to develop effective collaborative teams and navigate that.
So when you're a junior faculty member, being involved in these collaborations can be really helpful in getting funding and publishing into your career. But what advice would you give to younger scientists who are still trying to hold on to their scientific footprint?
Oh, well, as the junior person, getting advice from senior people who tell me what I should do or not, or I'll get in trouble, it seems a balance is again something that you want. So you want to have grants ideally where you're the lead and maybe the sole PI on it, and it's very clear that this is your expertise, your bread and butter sort of work. And then if you sprinkle in more collaborative grants alongside that, that's great, more the merrier, everyone's happy. But I guess I hear, in my field, I hear stories where there's trouble when it's everything is collaborative and everything is a co-PI, and then people they wonder, well, how much intellectual contribution did this person make over the last 6 years or whatever? And maybe they did make a great contribution, but the argument would have to be made, right? So case by case varies, but I guess in an ideal world, you have a bunch of sole PI money and a bunch of collaborative money and
just a bunch of money.
A bunch of money.
Also would be great. Does anybody else want to take a crack at that one? Okay, we'll move to the next question. Also, you guys feel free to ask any questions. Okay, what do you guys do specifically for broader impacts? Xiaobo, do you want to start? Because you do some pretty impressive stuff.
Sure. Actually, we had a broader impacts workshop last week, and I was on the panel. So typically, I would say typically, of course, because this thing can be, that's where you can be very creative. We do education, so education is part of the broader impacts, education, and then outreach, inclusion of underrepresented groups, like for my field, engineering, the females, and of course minorities, and these are kind of typical, I would say, scopes of broader impacts, and of course the actual broader impact, like societal impact of your work. If your work, especially, I can speak for engineering, if you cannot name a societal impact of your work, then I think that's not right. Definitely, you should be excited about the potential impact on the society, on let's say energy, health, and the environment, and those are kinds of things. You typically do not really emphasize too much, other than just mentioning it. But what people will look for is what kind of activities you would propose to as part of the broader impacts of the project. So I think, and of course, the diversity of the students, of course, you would say, not you would say, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but typically would try to recruit students from underrepresented groups. And it would be nice, again, it's just like preliminary data, if you actually have the data to show the track record, that's even better. Maybe that's not required if you're your first grant, but after a few years, if you have had already a few grants, then you better have show, okay, I have graduated how many female students or minority students. And then, because the nature of my work involves robots and sometimes artificial muscle materials, so we actually were able to use those things for outreach. And there would be, for example, a museum exhibit that's coming up next month, hopefully, if everything goes well. And then I also led the kind of establishment of research experience for teachers side program at MSU, and we have been doing that for the past 6 years. So I guess the track record, right? So if you propose something and that gets funded, and you said, I'm going to do this within this project, if you do it, and the next time you will have, again, you have preliminary data or a track record to support your new activities. I think that's basically, I guess, that's follow through, right? If you propose something and you get funded and you follow through that, and that's very important for the continual growth.
Oh, I'd like to point out that I actually got told by a program manager who we got funded for to actually tone down the outreach activity, where we were proposing to do some fun, interactive art, video game, in-lab experience. That sounded really cool, we thought.
Is he like, that sounds too fun?
That sounds cool, but it seems overly ambitious for the scope of this award. The panel said you should tone it down. So I thought, well, that's, okay, sure, I'll do less. But
so no, I guess I don't think people would discourage you if this activity is really going to be fun and doable. If it's out of kind of beyond the imagination, they might have question about whether this you're actually going to follow through. So I guess that's a very important point. You don't want to promise something that just sounds good.
I guess another thing I would note. I can put in a little bit of an advertisement for my college, Lyman Briggs. Part of our model is we have, students, focusing on the sciences, but they all have to take courses in history of science, philosophy of science, and sociology of science. So MSU actually has developed really a large number of people doing history of science, philosophy of science, and sociology of science in Lyman Briggs in association with other colleges. And so a lot of what we do fits naturally with broader impacts. So if it's appropriate, and if you're thinking, well, what could we do for broader impacts, you could always consider developing collaborations with some of those kinds of folks who it just comes naturally to. A lot of folks in my area are very interested in science communication. They're naturally, these historians are designing, museum, exhibits and things like that. The sociologists are very involved in engagement with communities, with science, and so on. So again, it may not make sense with all of your grants, but if you're wondering and if there is opportunities for collaboration, I think that can develop very rich sorts of broader impacts where there's not so much question of can these people do it, because you're collaborating with folks who specialize in that sort of thing. So anyway, if you're ever wondering, you can look up the deans at Lyman Briggs and say, do you have any faculty who might be interested in working on this sort of thing? And there's a decent chance there might be.
I would just add that, the broader impacts is actually quite important. If you just propose standard things, that's not going to help your grant shine. And so the panelists are always looking like, wow, that's really cool. I wish I'd thought of that. And that really is helpful. And I just echo, there's a lot of resources here at MSU to help you do that outreach. And so I work with the horticultural garden, and they have a children's garden, and I work on plants, so it's really easy. And they have, professional staff that know how to, work with kids and work with the public. And so I think if you look around campus, whatever your discipline is, I can guarantee you most of you will be able to find an entity that's already here engaging in outreach to the lay public. And you could probably go and talk with them, and that's when I go, wow, I just have to go over and say, we're going to work on mints, and Jessica will just come up with 10 experiments to do with third graders that I would never have thought of. And I think that's really important, that you try to think of something different. Because when I review grants and I see this standard broader impacts, and I'm just like, yep, you're going to train a female graduate student, and you're going to have a website, that's not very imaginative. And so people are definitely looking for something different, because another mission of NSF is to make sure that, the taxpayers understand that science research is an important component of, their mission and what they're doing. And so that's also pretty important, that you can convey to the taxpayers you're doing something that's relevant to them. Maybe not today, maybe there's an application in 5 or 10 or 20 years of what you're doing, but that it really is important. So.
Yeah, I think so as well. It's also your opportunity to convey your enthusiasm for what you work on to other people. You probably have people that live in your neighborhood who have no idea what you do. They might possibly know in the future. I think also if you look within your own lab and talk to postdocs and grad students, believe it or not, but they might have some other talents that don't have anything to do with science and lab. So if they're artists, or maybe they already work with children or do outreach on their own, you have no idea about it, this can be a really good resource. And I just wanted to add from Jim McCusker, he said that if there's something that you're doing that's really original and is going to stand out, it's worth it to dedicate one of a whole page in your proposal to this, because it can really work in your favor. Okay, let's move on. Okay, how do you guys deal with deadlines? And I wish that they would all be like, oh, I do it 2 months in advance, but it's not true. There's a lot of procrastinators that are really successful.
Well, so we definitely start early. We take care of a lot of the administrative stuff up front because I don't really want those last minute things bothering me towards the end. And I'm in CNS, and the grants office staff is extremely helpful. But I think the most important thing that you should know as a junior investigator, even me, once I say, okay, the grant's done, you can submit it, it goes over to CGA, and you need to be available to babysit it. That's what I call it, babysitting. I babysit the grant until it actually gets submitted, because even though they've proofed your administrative parts of your grant, sometimes they'll go, oh, this isn't quite right, and then the grant won't go. Like one time I was driving to Chicago on my laptop fixing something because it hadn't been caught, and we were only like 4 hours away from the deadline, and you just can't be doing that on a continual basis. So I think trying to do everything up front is great, but you also still have to remember that until it's actually submitted from the CGA office, it isn't submitted.
I don't think I do very well at dealing with deadlines. Sometimes towards sometimes last minute person, but it's hard. I guess it's just because everybody's busy. We're not just writing grants. We are teaching. We have students to advise, papers to revise, and paper deadlines. And so maybe you are working on multiple proposals. So it's really not sometimes realistic to say I put everything aside and work on the grant and finish 2 weeks or 3 weeks before the deadline. Having said that, I think it's just sometimes you have to be strategic about the time management, so that especially if you work with other people, and if everybody basically has to cooperate on when we have to put meeting together, when we have to provide the write-up to the lead PI, so these kinds of things will have to be considered, especially if we're pushing for a deadline. And now MSU has additional internal deadlines before your actual deadline, so that would sometimes put extra stress on the PIs. But I think it takes off stress towards the end. So I guess my end punchline is it's very difficult, question to how to handle deadlines, just because there are so many priorities in our life.
I guess I really like the point about getting administrative things done in advance, and so I guess I would just add to that, reiterate that, some of the things like getting everybody's bio sketches in, getting everybody's current and pending, funding in, starting to, work with, assuming hopefully some other folks are helping out with the budget, starting to work with those folks so that, even if some things end up, getting close to the deadline, there are some straightforward things that can be done in advance to help make it a little less painful at the end.
Yeah, I completely agree. Get the administrative stuff done early, because, and then the time you spend on a grant, it could be infinite, I suppose, like with many writing projects. So there is an advantage to procrastinating, because you have to spend your time on many other things, especially if you have a new lab and your students need a lot of babysitting. Then if you hole up in your office forever, then nothing or fewer things may get done in the lab. So procrastinating at least gives you a more reasonable time to devote to the project and not an open-ended time to devote to the project. It's a balance, obviously.
That's actually a very good point. You have to remember you cannot be perfect because you could have spent 2 years writing one grant. You could have spent 2 weeks writing one grant. The outcome might be, of course, might be different, but in very many cases might be the same. So just tell yourself enough is enough sometimes.
I think it's true. I think you can spend an infinite amount of time. And also, your time, there's a cost to your time as well. I edit a lot of grants and manuscripts, and I'm given them most of the time 2 or 3 days before the deadline. And when I talk to the people who've written them over the phone, I read through it once and talk to them, I can feel the sigh of relief. They're glad to get this off their desk and into the hands of someone else because they have things to do. And if you've never used an editor before and you have someone in your lab or someone that you can hire to do it, it can be really, really useful because they can really point out parts that might need more work, or they just copy edit the whole thing for you and tell you that the font and margins are great and it's ready to go, and it can it's a really good feeling. So moving on to the next point, it's about
Actually, we've got a question out here.
oh yeah, all right, thanks.
The question that I have might deal a little bit more with collaboration than deadlines, but it kind of brings in both of the concepts. I wonder how many of you work with statisticians to help design your studies. So that would either be collaborating even as a co-I role or something, or so how many of you do it, and then when do you incorporate the person? I work at CSTAT, the Center for Statistical Training and Consulting, and sometimes we get people, coming in well in advance, 2-3 months, and we really get to offer a lot more in terms of ideas and planning. But we often get requests for statistical help and planning a couple weeks in advance, and that's not necessarily, it doesn't allow us to do quite as much in that situation.
We wouldn't have that need for a statistician to help with the experimental design. If we needed someone to do a large amount of statistics on the project, we would just have them as a co-PI. So for my kind of proposals, it's not necessary to have that in the proposal at all.
For a philosopher, I'm just excited to have a social scientist who knows something about statistics, so I don't really.
We don't do that now, but it might change, right? Because in bio and NIH, for certain kinds of projects, now it's a new requirement that you have to plan a little more quantitatively and a little more carefully for your proposal. So a whole bunch of people are going to need that going forward.
Well, and actually, NIH and NSF are pushing towards more rigor and reproducibility, and so that's an important thing that takes a lot of advanced thought, and that's one of the things that we're kind of gearing up for at CSTAT a little bit, is providing some recommendations on how you might address that.
Any more questions? Okay, so we're going to move on into processing reviews. So a big part of being a scientist is rejections, right? Your experiments fail, your papers get rejected repeatedly, and so do your grants. These people appear as successful, but they haven't been successful in everything, right? You measure someone's success in science by the way that they rebound from this rejection. And so do you guys want to talk a little bit about how you process these reviews?
So what I do is I read them, get really mad, I put them in the drawer for like 2 weeks, and then I'll get them back out and I'll read them again, and then I'll make a decision like valid, especially if 2 reviewers make the same comment, right? And then I'll sort of process those, and then I'll call the program manager, or I'll make sure I see them at some point in the near future, and I get to talk to them about my grant. And what I do then is I'll email them and say, got my rejections, I'd like to talk to you, what could I do in terms of improving my grant. And then, they like to, schedule an appointment with you for the phone call. So I wouldn't cold call them because they like to sit down and think about and read your proposal and the reviews. And then I get feedback from them, and then I turn it back in, and hopefully I've addressed that. The biggest problem in my field is it's not like NIH where there's a sitting panel. The reviewers are different every time, and so they could critique you for putting in the changes that the previous panel told you to do. So it's a little bit of a gamble, but certainly you have to be open to the criticism. But definitely, we've all seen enough grants where some of the reviewers are clearly not qualified, or they focus on one thing that really, it may be a valid criticism, but it shouldn't have weighted that much. And so you have to learn to sort of filter those out and then change the proposal as you see fit to address those.
I think you said it very well. Maybe I can add to the point of interacting with your program manager. If possible at all, kind of establish some sort of relationship with your program manager so that, we know him or her well. When you call them, sometimes you can ask, basically, you can get information that's not written in the reviews because the program manager is sitting there listening to the panel discussion. So he or she might have additional input. Or sometimes the panel highly recommended the proposal, but finally they didn't get funded because the program manager still has some flexibility how to handle the recommendation. So in any case, the program manager may have her own opinion about the work or proposal. So if you can get that kind of information, I think that's the most valuable. For example, you can say, if I want to submit this next year, what do you think is going to enable the success? And he or she might tell you. Actually, I think at least one of my grants went through that way. Basically, was not funded first time, and he was saying, you guys really have to be able to justify why this material is the best thing to do, or why you want to spend so much energy on that, and so on. So things like that will be very valuable. So panel members change, but program manager sometimes doesn't change, right? So there's certain certainty, I guess, in this process.
So yeah, the flip-flopping natures of the reviews is like the biggest bane of all my friends who are junior faculty right now. It's the biggest complaint is back and forth. They told me to do this, and then they told me to do that, and then I changed this and changed that, and I guess there'll never be a fix for that unless they change the NSF review process. So yeah, just to emphasize, you kind of have to go with your own scientific gut and do what you think's right, taking into account the reviews, but you can't slavishly follow the reviews and just do what they say, because definitely that will not be a good strategy.
I guess I'd just reiterate, I think you're exactly right about the program managers, and just from my perspective, sort of just starting to test out NSF grant proposals initially, the program managers seemed like these sort of scary, shadowy figures. I wasn't sure, can I actually interact with these people? And it really is incredibly helpful to be able to get their feedback, and even not just with reviews, but with some of my work trying to figure out, would this proposal actually make sense with this particular program or another? And so that can be really helpful to get their thoughts on, is this actually the right place to be submitting this grant?
Do any of you want to talk about picking the reviewers, excluding the right people, and suggesting people? Oh.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question about, you go through a proposal, you submit multiple times, you get various suggestions exactly like you're saying, and you make revisions, and still can't seem to break. You still can't seem to break through the ceiling. You still can't seem to get funding, and I've experienced this. I had a colleague of mine who experienced this, and he actually bought a ticket, went to Washington, D.C., and met with the director of the program. When do you make that call? How do you make that call? How do you play that to your advantage? And is there a risk benefit to something like that? And he did it, and the benefit was that all of a sudden the next time he submitted his proposal, he was funded. But he went through about 4 iterations of rejections with NSF, and that's something I always kind of thought would be kind of a neat idea to do. But I just don't have the cojones to do that, I guess.
If you have the same proposal rejected 3 or 4 times, I probably have given up by that time. It's just you you have to look at the reviews. If the reviews are basically saying this is not going to work out, and then you try again with the same idea, of course, I think there's no point for doing that. But if every time you submit it, it's almost like very close. Every time is very close. I think you should do whatever you can to talk to the manager, go to Washington D.C. just to to fix the last part of the proposal. But so I guess that's when you have repeated failures, you have to be able to look through the review and get a sense whether the idea is worth it or not first.
Now, this is actually a question for my fellow panelists and others. So I've just been at MSU for a couple years. Before that, I was at the University of South Carolina. And when I was there, I would get these periodic emails saying, the USC plane is going off to Washington, in a month. And if you would like to get on it and go talk to a program manager, let us know and you can get a seat on the plane. I don't know if MSU ever does that kind of thing, but that significantly lowers the costs of actually pursuing that, and so it might, change the cost-benefit ratio. Can others comment on that? Yeah, looks like we might have.
PRGS does do cost share for your travels, so we will coordinate costs with your department or college with BPRGS, so we will at least support your travel. Plug.
Okay, do you want to talk about picking reviewers, suggesting excluding people?
Yeah, so you got to remember, whatever field you're in, it's a very small field, right? And so probably most of your colleagues are submitting a proposal too. And so I would hate to be a program manager because finding a qualified person to review my 150 proposals is actually a really hard job, right? Because everybody's on the conflict of interest list. So we actually, after we get the grant together, we sit down and we actually proactively think of people that are qualified to review our proposal. And you should really think of people outside the U.S. because usually the people inside the U.S. you have a conflict or they're going to be submitting too, so you might as well forget them. And so we actually get a list, and it's a fair list. We just don't get, dummy people. We get really well-qualified people that if the manager Googled them or did a PubMed search, they're going to say, yeah, this person's an expert in this field. And we list them, and then we also sit down and proactively think about our direct competitors who we would not want to see our proposal because they are direct competitors, or who we've had some, unprofessional interactions with, and we put them on the exclude list. And I know it took me many years before I actually did this proactively, and now for every grant that goes out the door, I sit down with the co-PIs and we discuss so that we have suggested to the panel manager some people. They're not going to take all of them, right? But at least we would give them one or two, and then we sit there and say, we know this person would not give us a fair review, or they're our direct competitor and we don't want them to see our ideas. And I think most people don't do this, but you can do it, and you can do it in many ways. Sometimes there's a specific form. You think you do it on Fastlane. You also should inquire about it with the program manager if you can't figure out where to do it. And they'll honor those. They'll honor those do not review excluded reviewers.
So I have never done that, but I think, as Robin said, if you do have some cases that convince you, okay, this person should not review my proposal, I think you should go ahead and do it. But in general, when I do not have any relevant information, I would rather excuse myself recommending or rejecting anybody for reviewing my proposal. I can cite, of course, I can use another scenario, which is for reviewing papers, right? So I served as associate editor for a few journals, and sometimes I can see authors will recommend preferred reviewers. And sometimes I found the preferred reviewers actually provide more critical comments than the reviewers I randomly pick. So it's never the case that you can for sure say, okay, this guy is my friend and he's going to help me out. And sometimes it's opposite.
I don't really have anything exciting to add. Those are really great, helpful comments.
Okay, I just wanted to remind everyone that the program officer, even though it doesn't seem like it, they actually want your best science to get funded. So call them, don't be afraid to call them and reach out to them and find out exactly what the reviewers want and what they're looking for and what was emphasized in the changes that doesn't come off the page to you. And the next time it comes around, maybe it will be your best science. It'll certainly be your better science. I think that's really important. Finally, it'd be great if you guys could share your best piece of NSF funding advice.
If you're more junior, like me, I would say try to get copies of successfully submitted proposals from senior people, mentors, other people you know that are directly in your field doing things very similar to you. And keep in mind that there are huge differences in the details across fields, and a lot of advice you can get will be contradictory for different fields. So the best advice is going to come from people who are successful in your field, who are probably the exact kind of people who are going to be reviewing you and who know what to expect. Because there's just such a huge variety of styles, of writing styles, of what you put on that first page, what you don't put on the first page, and there are expectations that are specific for your field.
I guess just two quick comments. One thing is, in addition to getting to see what other people have done, I found it really helpful in terms of trying to break into, NSF funding that I wasn't familiar with, was being able to collaborate with people with experience to, be a co-PI and sort of see how it works. And also, I think, as Chabot was pointing out, we all know how busy we all are, and I think it's helpful to remember how busy the reviewers are of the grant and how important it is to really make your main point and objectives crystal clear, and to be clear about your key concepts and defining them and using those throughout, and having the right kind of visual figures and so on to make it just very abundantly clear where the proposal is heading. Because again, with people being so busy, it just sort of shoots you in the foot if they can't figure out what's going on, or they have to work too hard to figure it out.
So I still remember, like almost 10 years ago, when I still was writing my first couple of grants, one NSF program manager was chatting at a conference, and he said, a good proposal should be really easy, just to have a few elements, right? One is why you are doing this, or particularly, why is this problem important? And the second thing is, where is the gap? Meaning, here's the state of the art, this is important, but where's the gap? And of course, the next sentence is basically, I'm going to fill the gap, right? And then that goes back to what you said, why you, right? You have to be able to say your unique expertise or background, and then finally your plan. The plan you can have a good idea, but you really have to have your technical proposal part be very solid. And there are a few things that we pay attention to. One is, for example, you always make sure you back up your statements and so on with either data or references. You cited enough references. Do not just include 20 references for proposal. Typically, I think our proposals are around 100 references. Just make sure people feel that you are aware of the state of the art. So another thing is, back to the reviewers are very busy, because typically, oftentimes, as a reviewer, I review the proposal last minute, which means I only have about 1 hour for one proposal. So and it's really the reviewer's objective is to shoot down proposals, because they cannot spend time discussing every proposal in great length, right? So I identify weaknesses. So if there are clear weaknesses, the proposal is very easy to be shot down. So make sure the reading experience is pleasant for the reviewer. So using very clear structure, very clear structure for the proposal, titles, section titles, pictures, and that way you have one less hurdle to worry about.
Well, I think the panel pretty much says it all. Just think, if you're the reviewer, and the first question when you get asked to be on the panel, I always write back, how many proposals do I have to read? And if it's more than 20, I'm like, no, I don't think so. Because you're really the panelist is going to be reading them probably in a very compressed period of time. And so if they're struggling to read your proposal, you might as well forget it. And so you got to do everything you can to make it a joy to read, so that the first thing the reviewer types is, this was such a joy to read. because then when they're in the room, they'll be the advocate for your proposal. Even if it had one or two weaknesses, they're excited, because that's what's going to happen is whoever's proposal has an advocate in the room and can really just, rally for that proposal, that one stands a chance of being funded the most. And so you got to make it exciting for people to read and easy to read. And, you definitely should have some figures in there and some color pictures, anything to break up 15 pages of text. The last thing you want to be is like reading and you're like, oh my goodness, it's like I'm on page 10 and I haven't seen a single figure. So cartoon figures of your workflow. I even sometimes will have at the end of the introduction or the end of the experimental plan, like a 3-sentence summary of experimental plan, summary of introduction, just because the reviewer's going to get lost in those 15 pages, and you need to sometimes reiterate, like, what was the whole point of this proposal? And so think of it in that terms that, the reviewer, the panelist is going to have 20 proposals to read, and they really do the same effort on each one, and the easiest one for them to read and get excited about is the one they're going to be excited about in their scoring and in the room when they're talking about it. And I think that's the thing I've seen. And the other thing, if you have one NSF grant, you should write the program manager, you should ask to be on a panel, and you'll learn more being on that panel than 5 years of writing your own and just getting reviews back. I mean, so I think that's important.
So if I can echo the last point, actually, before you get a grant, you don't have to have a grant. If you don't have a grant, I think it's probably even more important for you to be on the panel, because you want to see how other people are actually, processing the proposals, and that will give you a lot of, I think, ideas about what to avoid, what to promote in your proposal. And so you do have to be able to kind of get in touch with the program manager, either introduced by someone else who is more senior, or you just volunteer. So make sure that you get a chance to serve on any panel. Sometimes it doesn't have to be exactly your core program. You just need to see the process. It's because all the processes are pretty much the same for different panels.
That's great advice. I think it's really important what you said, creating a fan. Someone who's going to go to bat for your proposal. And if you're on the other side of it, by being on a panel, you realize that your proposal might be the last proposal someone's reading at bed at night at 11:30. And it's one of those times where it's such a tedious proposal, they've read through 3 pages and can't recall anything. And, using bold-faced type and using one picture on each page. We've all read that really long proposal. We were kind of like thumbing ahead and really hoping for some huge figures in there. If you can kind of use this rule of thumb of using one figure per page and having things that are easy to follow and pleasurable to read and trying to use first person and breaking up your sentences, I think you can turn it around and make it something really great. And by being on a panel and reading a variety of proposals, you can see what a difference that could make. So I think we're going to go ahead and end here. Oh, we have a question.
We've got another question.
Sorry.
You've already started addressing it, but I was just going to ask how to get on a panel. Somebody said that you could volunteer, but I'm wondering who you contact first to do that, if you haven't been on one before. Like, do you call a program officer that you're interested in their area and just say, hey, I'd love to do this?
Yeah, you can call, you can write an email, and you can shoot multiple emails to different people. For me, actually, I got invited to a panel when I was a postdoc. The only reason I could think of was I actually submitted at that time a proposal with my advisor as a co-PI. So sometimes it's just like, editors looking for reviewers for papers. The program managers also have a hard time finding reviewers. So it's a matter of just, being willing to reach out to these guys and saying, yeah, I'm expert in this. I'm really interested in this program. I hope I can learn more. So just be very modest and saying, I want to learn this process. I'm young. I want to, your advice, whatever. So that make them happy, and they will say, okay. And the other thing is just as I said, your colleagues and your former advisors, your friends can all help you, get you to a panel.
Okay, great. So I have a 4-seminar series coming up, so I hope I'll see some of you in there. What I really love about doing grant work is that I get to learn about people's science, and I get to help you turn that science into a really great story that gets you money to carry out a project. Like, that's pretty awesome. So yeah, I hope to see some of you there. Thank you for coming today and join me in thanking our panelists.
So before we break off, I have a question for you.
You have a question for
How
me?
do we get hold of you? If I have like grant, I can just ask you, say, okay, can you edit my proposal?
Yes. I mean, you can also
How does it
go,
work?
you can go through MSU. Oh, man.
Oh, wait. Yeah, mind if I jump in on that one?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
My name's Jeff Croft. I'm with VPRGS. And actually, I'd encourage you to email or contact me. We have the editing services. We've been doing NIH grants for almost 2 years now. We've been doing an NSF pilot program last semester. So we ask you to fill out the form because your college needs to know that we're going to share costs on contracting an editor. We do a 60-40 split. The college pays 40, the VPRGS does 60. But then we connect you with editors like Heidi, like Tom, Tom back there, to do the editing process.
So do these proposals have to be like large grant or just like even single PI grant?
For NSF, they can be smaller. Again, we're still trying to make sure to prove viability with that program. The NIH tend to be early career or over $500,000 for cost, but on a case-by-case basis. I'd encourage folks to contact us. We're looking to expand because we've seen success on the NIH side, and we anticipate, obviously, again, with only having 9 months worth of NSF we haven't had a lot of responses yet, but we definitely want to have a chance to help folks out.
Yeah, it's a huge thing. Like, use an editor. So, I mean, you don't have to use me, but even if you use like an undergraduate in journalism or something, it makes such a huge difference. Because I can see it. I've done a lot of science writing, but the way it's just like a huge relief. Like I can take a shower and eat some cereal now. This girl is working on it for a couple hours, and then it comes back to you, and it's in really good shape. But yeah.
If you don't mind, I'd like to give Lauren a chance to let folks know about other services available via
Yeah, of
VPR.
course. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Lauren Ernie Flessner. I'm with the Office of Research Facilitation and Dissemination, and I actually want to address your question just a moment ago. Our office will also provide formatting and editing services for grants, and while we focus primarily on large multi-institutional and multidisciplinary grants, we will also, as time is available to us, work on smaller grants. So please feel free to contact us if you need grant writing support. So our office provides grant writing support from proposal editing and formatting through working on budgets and helping with some of the supplementary materials that go in with your grant application package. We also host seminars on a monthly basis called Coffee Breaks, and there's a flyer in the hall that lists the upcoming coffee breaks, so please take a look at that. Our next one is on Thursday next week. We provide funds for faculty members to travel to DC to meet with program officers in person, and we try to help offset the cost of those trips. And again, those funds are usually matched by your college or your department. And then finally, we meet with investigators individually to help them identify appropriate federal, state, and foundation sources of funding for their projects. So if you would like to contact us for services, please visit the VPRGS website.
Okay, now and when can you join me in thanking all the panelists?